Here we'll run through a couple of full hypothesis tests. So really important here is that we will learn how to actually carry out every hypothesis test that we encounter. But here the objective is to merely illustrate what is happening. So if you are unsure about where the figures come from, how we know to use those specific methods, don't be alarmed. We're not there yet. All that matters here is that we are able to follow along and see the pieces of the hypothesis come together. So we'll start with the Castaneda v. Partita Supreme Court case. So if you recall, this was a Supreme Court case heard in the late 1970s about whether juries selected in a specific county in Texas were representative of their population. Namely, if we state the hypotheses, we were talking about a proportion among the population of jury duty selected citizens of Mexican American heritage. So ultimately we're assessing a claim about a population proportion where it is meant to be 79% of the population, which is Mexican American, is also selected for juries. The alternative hypothesis is that this proportion is actually much lower. In fact, statistically significantly lower. So, what we have here is a claim about population proportion P which is the number of Mexican Americans selected for jury duty among the whole jury pool. So, knowing what we know here, based on a sample that is fairly large, so specifically, in this court case, over 11 years, so the underlying conditions, over 11 years, 870 people were selected for jury duty. And of these, we found a sample proportion P hat, which is 0.39 roughly, okay? If you wanted to find out what the exact number of people in that group were Mexican Americans, you could reverse engineer this formula to find X. But under these conditions, we can reliably use what is called the one proportion Z test, which we'll discuss in detail later in this video set. But so in this case, it's reasonable to use the Z distribution, the standard normal distribution. And if we sketch the sampling distribution, assuming the null hypothesis is true, this is a left-tailed test because we are testing and we have an alternative hypothesis where the population proportion is actually less than 0.79, and under the conditions of this test at the alpha level of significance that we wanted, we could specify our critical value, bounding the left tail, and specifically using the test statistic that we use, and again, we haven't discussed this in detail yet, but the test statistic that we use here is the sample proportion minus the population proportion that we assume to be true, divided by the square root of the hypothesized population proportion minus times the complement of that, divided by the sample size, taken as the square root, all underneath that. And from this, using the p-value approach, the p-value method, we obtain a p-value which is on the order of 10 to the negative 33. Something so unbelievably small that it's absolutely guaranteed to be less than alpha, which normally is something along the lines of 0.05, 0.01. And based on this, the correct decision is to reject the null hypothesis, as the Supreme Court justices did. So, based on this, we reject the null hypothesis. So, formally, at the alpha level of significance that is specified, there is sufficient evidence, more than sufficient, to reject the claim that a representative proportion of jury duty members are Mexican American, and that representative proportion would have been somewhere along the lines of 0.79, when in fact it's actually much, much lower. We have reason to suspect it's much lower. And that's the formal conclusion. So all told, here's what the hypothesis test does. So the steps for NHST. Number 1, we identify the parameter or parameters we're testing the claim about. What? Oh no. What is the claim about? 2, what are the hypotheses and how do we express them symbolically? 3, we identify the appropriate theory-based approach, and that depends on the specific conditions of the underlying sample and the population, and it depends on what kind of parameter we're examining. We then establish a level of significance, alpha, and we determine summary statistics from an appropriate random sample. This is always going to be given to us, the random sample. The summary statistics, though, may or may not be given to us, and we might need to calculate them. 6, we calculate the appropriate test statistic. And 7, we use a method that's appropriate. So we can use the critical region method or the critical value method, the p-value method, or a confidence interval method. 8, we make our decision. We either reject the null hypothesis or fail to reject the null hypothesis, which should be appropriate depending on what we found from the previous step. And lastly, we restate the decision taken in terms of the original claim. So while we may have been working symbolically throughout, at the very end, we return to our original context. What is the original claim about? We state the decision in terms of that.